the idea between positive psychology and is to say, like, we're trying to focusing on identifying what's good, awesome, and excellent inside of you and how we can utilize that to help you to live happier, healthier, and better lives. There is a genetic set point, so we're all programmed in such a way to have some level of baseline positive experience that we will always go back to.
We personalize these interventions so that people are adhering to them longer term and therefore actually seeing the benefits longer term for their mental health and potentially preventing future incidences of mental illness. I think that can have a huge impact upon society and the mental illness and mental health burden that many societies globally are facing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show. Today we have a special 2-hour deep dive into the fastest growing discipline in psychology, positive psychology. Today's guest is Dr. Llewellyn van Zyl, who is an assistant professor in work and organizational psychology, a world-renowned researcher in positive psychology, and an organizational psychology consultant. In today's episode, we discuss how much of your happiness is influenced by your genetics, how to flourish at university and in the workplace, the real reason companies hire organizational psychologists, and why the career advice "follow your passion" needs a rethink, as well as much, much more in this special 2-hour episode. Now to the discussion with Dr. Llewellyn van Zyl.
Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental wellbeing. Dr. Llewellyn van Zyl, thanks for joining me on the Mental Wellbeing Show.
Thank you very much for having me.
I know you're a busy man. I was going through your Google Scholar profile and you've published, I think, 50 plus papers in the last 10 odd years since completing your PhD. So I appreciate you taking time out.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really curious and really excited to kind of like talk to you about the stuff that we've been busy with for the past couple of years.
Yeah, and speaking of what you've been busy with, so you're primarily researching into positive psychology. One of the big questions, I suppose, positive psychology is concerned with is what the definition of happiness is. So what is your definition of happiness and of well-being, if they're different at all?
So I think my PhD was on happiness like 10 years ago. And I think there hasn't really been much development in what happiness actually is since then. So there's basically three main philosophical ideas. You have like this hedonic approach where it basically says it's the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Think about like dinner's life satisfaction as an example. Then you have this more eudaimonic approach, which really talks about you as an individual living in relation to your strengths, living your best possible life, having a balance between what's meaningful and what's draining energy. So it's really you living in accordance with your true self. So you living your strengths. And the final approach is more like this integrative, holistic approach that kind of like samples a little bit of everything. So think about something like Seligman's PERMA model or Corey Keyes' mental health continuum as an example. So the idea behind positive psych and stuff is really to see like we want to have this figuring out what this end all and be all positive state is. And for a very long time, up until about 5 or so years ago, the focus was on trying to figure out what is it that makes people happy, because that's the end all and be all state. And to differentiate that a little bit from mental well-being or mental health, for example, the more integrative or more holistic approach that we kind of accept is this whole thing from Corey Keyes that talks about in order for you to be mentally healthy, there needs to be a balance between the positive and negative. But he basically says that mental health is on two dual continua. There's a continua, think about a straight line for pathology, and there's a separate straight line for well-being. So if you ask any second-year psychology student to explain mental health for you, they'd say, oh, you're on pathology on the one end, you have normal in the middle, and you have well-being and mental health, positive mental health on the other. So on a single scale, but that's not necessarily the case. A person can be totally pathological. Think about someone like a narcissist, right? But he can also be flourishing. And as we know, narcissists and people with antisocial personality disorder, they're all among us. They're not necessarily in prison. So how do these people function? Think about lawyers, doctors, surgeons are, for example, the highest profession for people with antisocial personality disorder. And they're pathological, but they're also flourishing, right? So they're also highly functioning. So you can be on both of these ends. And Corey Keyes basically said that mental health is then a function of you feeling good, emotional well-being, functioning well, psychological well-being, and fitting in, social well-being. So you have to feel good, function well, and fit in. If you have these three components in place, you're more likely to have positive mental health. So I think that's the difference between the happiness, the positive state by itself, and then the well-being, which is more a continuous internal process.
So is that, as far as you're concerned, is that the most kind of evidence-based model that we have? Because I've seen a bunch of different models, and even I get confused, running through all the literature. Okay, so just a very simple question: what is happiness? But is that the most evidence-based model we have at this point in time?
So this is from a very Western perspective, right? So most of these models are very individualistically focused, and so you can also look at more holistic models from like the Eastern and African cultures as an example, where mental health and well-being and happiness is a function of not only what's going on inside of me, but also as a function of my community and how my community functions. So for example, in where I grew up, was in a town called Vanderbijl Park, and right next to it there was this big petrochemical company, think Shell, right? And at this petrochemical company, they had this massive influx from people. So the people that they would hire to work for them are people that's in the rural communities right around physically right around the plant. So what they kind of like realized is that they have a high staff turnover rate. So in other words, the people come in and they leave very fast. So what they started to do was they started to invest in the local communities around. So they would, like, for example, put up schools, right? Provide electricity infrastructure, maintain the roads, all of these types of elements, which for you and me, it's like, okay, well, I don't care if someone's building a new school here or whatever, but from their culture, it is like these people are investing in my community. They're helping my children and my family function in a safe and happy environment, and etc. And therefore, I'm more inclined to stay with your company. So just to give an indication of how that works. So it's less about me, myself, but well-being is more about my community and my family. So those are two totally different approaches. But seeing that you're in a Western culture, in Australia, the more holistic approaches towards well-being and things are these individualistically focused models, like Corey Keyes' mental health continuum. And it's also the one that I subscribe to because it's a lot easier to explain, and it is broad enough for you to assess and diagnose mental health in a very simplistic manner.
That brings to mind that weird phenomenon, which I know you've done a fair bit of research, right? The Western educated, industrialized, I think rich and democratic. The definitions kind of differ across cultural contexts, right?
Yeah, so they basically say that most of these psychological approaches and theories and things, and even assessment tools and interventions, are developed in these weird contexts. So if you think about something like positive psychology, it started in America, a Western country. It is facilitated. So the questionnaires that we use, like the mental health continuum, all of these questionnaires, they are validated with highly educated people. So because we're using students for most of our research, especially when we develop new stuff, so we can test it out with them. So we have Western people, highly educated, democratic countries, usually very rich. Right. So this is kind of the approach, or the acronym that we use for very westernized orientated approaches, which is most of these things that we do. We kind of know when we take these Western theories. I think let's talk about psychometric tests. So if we take something like the grid scale or the Flourishing instrument or whatever, if you take that scale that's developed in a Western country and you apply it in an African context, you kind of all of a sudden realize the factor structures of the instrument don't look the same. In other words, people don't see the the overall thing the same, and the subconstructs they also don't evaluate it the same as what they would have done in the US, for example. We interpret the items differently. Like I've mentioned about the African context, we know there's an issue on one of the instruments where we say that on a scale of 1 to 5, how likely are you, or what, I can't remember what the exact item was, but it's something to do with my level of happiness is totally focused on me living my best self or me achieving my goals. And we know that that item doesn't work. So it doesn't load on any of these constructs, because in that context, that concept of me living my best life, for example, me doing what I want, how I want, where I want, is not associated with happiness for people, because it's nothing to do with the community. So these things just don't work in these contexts, but people sell it as if it does work in these contexts. And that's where there's some issues at the moment.
I wonder as well, like for people who live in more weird contexts, like I live in Australia, right, quite a westernized country, but my background is Sri Lankan, so that's a bit more of a collectivist kind of society. You know, how these definitions play when you've got, you know, people who are at the kind of cross section of these different cultures. I don't know if there's been any research looking at that, but
for the individual or for the group? Because I mean, if you talk about like you as an example, that's half Australian, half or like Australian, like you're living in Australia but you're Sri Lankan. With that cultural clash, or we're talking about like the group as you as functioning as a Sri Lankan in Australian environment with Chinese people and whoever.
Yeah, I like how well-being, what the components of well-being might differ to say someone who is from an Anglo-Saxon background living in Australia, you know, to kind of individualist cultures versus the mixture that I have of collectivist and individualist. I wonder how that would differ.
So remember, it doesn't matter where you're staying. It depends on how you were raised, right? You can still be you can still live in a collectivistic household. In other words, you're raised in that culture, even if you're in the middle of Texas, as an example, right? So it really is about how you function, but you also start to adopt more individualistic values as you are integrating more into this society. So if you were born there and raised, you will of course have your home culture, but you will also have the culture when you walk outside with your university and your friends. So you learn new things that's not necessarily attached to your home environment. Now, I'm not really sure if there's anything done specifically on well-being for people that live in that or function in that type of environment. But I do know there is studies where the two is like split and brought together. So if you think about like multicultural contexts, there's a lot of work on how if we work in one organization, for example, how we have to manage different people from different backgrounds, as an example, or how to facilitate their mental health and well-being. But I'm not really sure about the first aspect.
An interesting point I might look into further. One of the big kind of happiness facts, I suppose, that I've come across lately is some work by Sonia Lyubomirsky. I might be butchering that last name. I do apologize if I am. But looking at kind of how much of our happiness is actually under our control. And it seems to be that she's kind of found that 40 to 50% of our happiness is kind of determined by our conscious actions. So what are your thoughts on that? And is that kind of, again, is that real evidence-based, concrete kind of findings that there is about half of our happiness that we can directly influence with our actions?
Okay, so it's a nice metaphor of the whole happiness pie thing from Sonia Lyubomirsky. So she basically found did a lot of research like back in the day, like in the early 2000s, where she looked at a lot of the things, for example, from twin studies as an example, to kind of like look at when people are like born and they're separated at birth, do they still have same experiences and they still function the same years later? So they've done a lot of that type of work back in the beginning, and they said like 50% is genetically imprinted, 10% is your environment, and 40% is under your direct control. So that was the original narrative that's been kind of like with us for the last 20 years or so. But we kind of like know that that's not necessarily the case, because we're all individuals with different components in us that functions in it. So the idea then, her original idea was to say, like, if you come from a very bad environment, so you're emotionally and psychologically abused, and only your level of well-being and happiness is only affected 10% by that. Now think about that just logically for a moment. if you're in consistently for your entire childhood in an environment where you were physically, emotionally abused at home, at school, right? Your entire environment is negative. Can you 100% tell me that your level of happiness, that environment only affects you by 10%? It's not the case. So it's been disproven quite a lot recently, but the idea is basically the same, right? There is a genetic set point, so we're all programmed in such a way to have some level of baseline positive experience that we will always go back to, right? And we do know that the environment affects us, and we do know we are in control of how we think, feel, and function, how we respond to situations. But the percentage attribution to those things will differ from person to person. But you are under direct control. So we can teach you how to think more positively about things and how to restructure the way in which you approach stuff and how to reframe things in a more positive manner. So we can teach you that, but your environment still plays a massive role.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to really appreciate that that you can influence that, because then you're more likely to take those positive steps towards augmenting your well-being and happiness. And that's kind of the foundation of a lot of the research in positive psychology, which you've done, which is looking at some of these interventions as to how we can improve well-being and happiness. So when we say positive psychology, what is the difference or the distinction between positive psychology and, say, other psychology?
I think it's important to understand that positive psychology is just a focus, right? And I think back in the day, and also one of the main criticisms is that when this new discipline was founded, it fictitiously made a divide between what they refer to as negative psychology, pathology, and positive psychology, well-being, and prosperity. It's important to understand that originally there was this difference, but that's not necessarily how it's viewed right now. So originally, positive psychology was positioned as a discipline to study what was not studied before, to study the positive state traits and behaviors that people exhibit that help people to live happier and healthier lives, with the end to flourish, right? So we were looking at what are the positive aspects of human characteristics. So where negative psychology, in inverted commas, focused on understanding psychopathology and the criteria underpinning depression, stress, anxiety, pathology, and etc., positive psychology wanted to do the same thing, but looking at positive state traits and behaviors. Where, let's say, general psychology, I don't like to call it negative, say general psychology is focused on, for example, the DSM-5 as the criteria book to diagnose mental disorders. The positive psychology version of that is the VIA strengths inventory, which takes the same approach and applies the same way of how to diagnose positive state traits and behaviors and capture them as a mechanism to show you what are the criteria for strengths, for example. So the idea between positive psychology and is to say, we're trying to focusing on identifying what's good, awesome, and excellent inside of you and how we can utilize that to help you to live happier, healthier, and better lives.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And you've looked at a lot of work kind of looking at some of the criticisms and some of the limitations of positive psychology as a field. Can you run us through some of those?
So I think the field was officially started in 2000 with Martin Seligman, considered the father of the field, that did this speech at the American Psychological Association when he became president, to say that we have to focus on this stuff. And it all stemmed from this paper that they wrote in the American Psychologist in 2000, which basically created this idea that we have to study these things. But to be honest, looking at the paper itself, it was more of a marketing initiative back then. Americans have this tendency to kind of take things and repackage it in such a way that it looks like a totally new field. And from that, that's kind of some of the criticisms kind of stem from this, because there was no scientific underpinning facilitating this kind of process. So we actually went for the past year and we looked at all of the criticisms from the second decade of positive psych. So the first stuff was always about, there's no positive psychology already existed many years ago. So if you look at, for example, in my opinion, the first positive psychologist was Carl Jung, looking at things like creativity, for example, and looking at things like, or reframing stuff like depression, saying that depression is not necessarily, in inverted commas, a negative emotion, but it's the way of your unconscious mind to communicate to your conscious mind something that needs to change. right? So he looked at all of these positive characteristics. Maslow, that every first, second year student knows about, focused on self-actualization, right? So we look at Viktor Frankl, 1945, 1960, talking about meaning, right? Positive approach. These things existed. So the original criticisms were all about, this is nothing new, doesn't contribute anything, you're creating a fictitious divide, and etc. But since then, we kind of like went into this new approach. We started to look at things like, maybe they're right, maybe positive and negative stuff are actually together, they actually work. So think about something like, from Viktor Frankl's work, you do need suffering in order to facilitate your understanding of what's meaningful to you, right? So suffering is a very big component of existentialism. And we understand, for example, something like post-traumatic growth. We know that a person that goes through, think about rape victims, that's where it started. You go through this horrific experience, and then all of a sudden you start to learn and you grow from it, and you come out, in inverted commas, a better person years later. So there's some growth that took place because of this event. So there's a negative thing that happened, but because of this, you grow. So we kind of like started to realize that there is actually this connection between positive and negative stuff. Okay. So we did this systematic literature review that was just published in the Journal of Positive Psychology recently. And we found that there's, during the last 10 years, there's around 117 different or distinctive type of criticisms. But don't worry, I'm not going to run you through all of them. It's too much. But we basically clustered them all into 6 broad themes, right? So I think that the 2 most important ones is that the idea behind it said like positive psychology really lacks this unifying meta theory that is really grounded in some philosophical idea and try to really figuring out what is actually positive and what not. So the idea behind it is to say that positive psychology lacks proper theorizing, so we don't really have a very in-depth understanding of human nature, for example. So if you think depth psychology or Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, there's a very proper and deep understanding of what human nature is, the phases of its development. We don't really have that. There's so much inconsistencies in what is in terminologies, for example. So if you think about something like just the word flourishing, which is the top-end human experience. So according to Keyes, it's you feel good, function well, and fit in, right? And you've got moderate, you've got languishing, moderate, and high, and flourishing on a type of scale. So that is one definition of flourishing. But then you have Dinner that talks about, the whole component of Keyes about functioning well, so psychological well-being. He just repackaged psychological well-being as flourishing. So there are 2 different definitions of this thing. If you think of something like grit, for example, it's the function of having a long-term interest in something and having high levels of perseverance. But there's also these didactic models that talks about things like, it's industriousness is a component, and there's these multifaceted models of grit that talks about the interaction between myself and my environment, environmental mastery. Same concept, same word, totally different meanings, different philosophical ideas. Even something as as simplistic as the word positive, right? What is positive? There's no agreement on that. So we use same terminologies for different things, but we kind of attribute these things to be the same kind of thing. So all of this stuff is kind of like the first 2 things really about this type of things. There's no real underlying meta theory that pulls positive psychology together. The next part, which I think most people can relate to, is the whole concept of measurement, right? So we kind of like know that positive psychology is the fastest growing discipline in psychology, right? It grew a lot faster than any of the other sub-disciplines, but we kind of also know that we kind of took a lot of shortcuts in that respect. So we have issues with how we measure things. So if you think about something like the strength use scale from Giovanni and Lindley, we also did a study on that recently, where they just literally they had 10 items or so that they created to measure strengths use, went to 200 students, just asked them to complete the questionnaire, quickly did just the EFA, exploratory factor analysis with the principal component analysis, and said, okay, this is the scale. And this is the most popular scale that's used for strengths use, yet different factor structures. The instrument always gives issues. And that's the same for many of the instruments that we have. We take quick and dirty measures to kind of get to these instruments just to get something out there. And we also kind of like know that how we operationalize these constructs, they're also like measured differently by different people, because every person wants to have a little slice of that pie. So they all want to have their little aspect attached to it. So we have different measures now for the same construct. And when we throw these instruments together, they don't even talk to each other. There's not a lot of variance overlap. Positive psychology is also very much quantitatively driven in a way. So we empiricize everything. So if you can't quantify it in our mind, it's not scientific, or at least that was the review of the critics. So we use a lot of empirical research, and we use a lot of cross-sectional studies. So basically, we go out and we ask one group of people something, and we ask them to complete a bunch of questionnaires, and we try to get that published. Where in more established subdisciplines, you'll have multiple studies or have longitudinal studies or something a bit more robust. So from that perspective, it was really seen that we really lack robust research methods and approaches. So very little qualitative, very little experimental research, and very little mixed methods in our in the discipline. So that was the second main thing that we found. And the third one was, which I think most people kind of like talked about, is like positive psychology is pseudoscience, right? You can't really replicate the findings, and there's really not a lot of evidence for the things that people are saying. So there are two issues here: looking at it as a pseudoscience, and two, poor replication of results. So there is a lot of merit here. So if you look at something, if we talk about like poor replication, which is also an issue in social psychology, the broader psychology field, so it's not just unique to positive psych, but something like the gratitude visit, which is a very famous, very important intervention in our field, where you go out, you write a letter of 250 words to someone that has meant the absolute world to you, that's changed your life. You make an appointment with these people, or this person, you go to them, you read them the questionnaire, the letter, and it's supposed to show increases in happiness and well-being and etc. significantly over a long period of time. But we know that in many studies, this is not the case. We know that many of these psychological interventions that we have do not necessarily work like we thought they do. So we can't really replicate the same results over and over. I think the only thing is mindfulness-based stress reduction, and mindfulness is the only thing that's kind of been consistent. So we have poor replication of our studies. And the pseudoscience thing is really saying that we make false claims about the benefits of positive psych. So that's more a marketing issue. That's more practitioners taking the research and blowing it up into something that it's not. It's kind of like there's intellectual dishonesty, or perceived as intellectual dishonesty. So if you look at the critical positivity ratio from Barbara Fredrickson as an example, they kind of disproved it. Kind of like showing that they used the wrong analytical technique for what they actually found. So there's these types of debates. So kind of like saying that it's not a real science. You can't really measure happiness. Anecdotally, with my doctoral proposal, it was about happiness and happiness interventions. That was around 2008 when I started, and I remember I had to submit my proposal for evaluation 3 times. And during the first and second time, during the second and third time, I only changed 1 word. But the idea that the comments was always like how you can't measure happiness. Happiness is not measurable. It's a feeling. It's a thing, and you can't develop it. So it took a lot of time for me to convince people that it is actually measurable. So, and that is also the same narrative that some critics also have, that most of the things that we say we can measure, we can't. So pseudoscience. The fourth thing I think was it's not really something new, like I've mentioned, and it basically self-isolates itself from mainstream psychology, which was really the case back in the day. Back in the day, which kind of, if you look at grit as another example, it was basically just repackaging perseverance and putting it into a new jacket and saying it's something new, for example, or taking something like, if you look, I'm not sure if you know PsyCap, Psychological Capital from Luthans, which is very popular in organizational psych that says psychological capital is like hope, resilience, optimism, etc. And it's not something new, but all that Luthans did was he went to 4 areas of research that's very well established and just pulled them together, the same questionnaires, put them together and said, okay, this is now psychological capital. So they were really right in that sense in the beginning. And then we also kind of like found that there was this split between positive and general psych, but as we move the field develops, we kind of start to realize that there's more integration into it. So that the second last one, and when we went through all of these papers, there was this word that I didn't know, but it came up in every single one of the papers. It basically said that positive psychology is like a decontextualized neoliberalist ideology that causes harm. Didn't know what neoliberalism meant up until I read 30 papers about it. But it basically says that everything is about you. Self-fulfillment is from only you have the power to change your life, and your environment doesn't matter, and it's an ideology and etc. But decontextualized, like we spoke about, it's Western stuff being applied in positive context. And I think the most important part here for me, which is something I also didn't realize, which holds a lot of value, was that positive psychology also does cause harm. And what do I mean by that? The mere fact that there is a positive diagnosis, so say you're flourishing, it means there's automatically a category of people that are not flourishing, languishing, right? And that creates stigma, for example. The same thing with this gratitude visit. There was a couple of studies that showed that it actually causes certain groups of people to actually increase their stress and anxiety. Think absolute engineers, right? The stereotypical idea of an engineering student, introvert, don't really like to. They go into this field because they don't really want to be around people that much, and etc. Forcing them to do this, they're not gonna have a good time, right? So it made them more anxious, more depressed than before. So we also know that just because something has a positive flavor doesn't mean that it's going to have a positive effect. And the sixth idea was really about that positive psych is a capitalistic venture. It's a mechanism to kind of like make money, which is true, right? But it's also important to understand that even though, like, if something is making money, if there is a market for it, it means there's value in it. So someone's not going to buy an iPhone if the iPhone didn't add value to that person's life. If it's not a good idea, or if it's not actually working or improving their life in some way. So the idea behind capitalism or this capitalistic venture is to say that it's actually just a way to make money. But if you look at it in a very practical sense, we charge money so we can scale these things, because the technology and the development cost of these things do cost something. And to scale something up, you need infrastructure, and infrastructure, for example, costs money. But there are also many institutions like Penn State University and the Optentia Research Program and the Greater Good Science Center. These people provide free services, from their instruments to interventions to whatever, for people. So I think there is a balance. So these are the 6 broad criticisms that we kind of like identified from the literature.
Yeah, okay, perfect. And one of the common kind of themes that seems to come out there is this notion of how it might benefit the individual researchers to, say, repackage something, repurpose something. How much of that, as a researcher yourself, do you think is influenced by that kind of publish or perish culture that, you guys as researchers are, subject to, understanding the context of the pressures that researchers face to publish, to put out novel research?
I think you hit the nail right in the head there, Indy. I think the big thing is, like, everybody wants to just have this little slice of this pie, that really wants to do something that's unique. Unfortunately, doing something unique takes a lot of time and a lot of money. So the easiest way for people to do is to either take something, repackage it, call it something else. This is jingle jangle fallacy, right? Where things are basically putting a little jacket on or whatever to make it look new. And I really think it has to do with the fact that we're not really doing good and novel research anymore. It's a lot easier to take things from other disciplines and call them something else, or to take a couple of stuff, like I said, with psychological capital, and throwing it together and making something new. I mean, I'm guilty of this myself. If we look at something like this gratitude thing, or the life crafting. Life crafting is an easier example. So me and one of my PhD students, we looked at all of the crafting behaviors, like job crafting and family crafting, etc. And we kind of like looked at what was the overlap, and we basically said that, well, a person is not just a person at work, and he's not a separate person in his life, and he's not a separate person in his relationship, and he's not a separate person in his family. He's the same person, so he uses the same skills and capabilities. So the same behaviors that they exhibit crafting behavior should be the same. It can't be different in these contexts. So we just went and we looked at what's the same between all of these aspects. We found like there's 8 things. We threw them together. We saw what worked, and in the end, we found out there's like 3 clusters of behaviors that people exhibit. So we also do the same thing. And it's really about trying to do something more holistic and new in respect, but doesn't really add that much value.
Well, I think it's so important, these criticisms that you've outlined, and understanding the context that researchers may, the pressures that they face, because ideally what I'm trying to do with this podcast is to help and empower people particularly who may not have a science background, but also people like psych students who do have a science background, to be able to critically analyze positive psychology research, happiness, self-help books, because there's a lot of this being put out now in kind of the pop psychology, self-help kind of world. So I think it can be really difficult, particularly for people without a science background, to be able to critically analyze what they're reading. A lot of authors might cherry pick certain stats, and you might take that as gospel, for example. But what kind of advice would you have for people reading self-help literature, positive psychology books on happiness, well-being, these kind of hot topics, to be able to actually critically analyze what they're reading and make more informed and evidence-based choices to augment their well-being and happiness? Because I think ultimately that's what they're looking for when they pick up these books or watch these YouTube clips, etc.
Again, this is a very sore topic for me, because I think on the one end, these things need to be communicated to the audience, right? So there's a big need for it, and there needs to be a way to easily transfer the things that we write and that people do into more digestible ways for people to consume. The problem that we've identified is basically threefold. The one is that practitioners or writers, they go out and they, like you say, they cherry pick information. And they take information out of context in order to justify a certain point. So we do, for example, in the beginning of positive psych's development as a discipline, there was a lot of cross-sectional studies as an example, right? And what they would do, we would initially write it in such a way that it's applicable to everything. But we kind of realized that's a mistake. We should not be doing that. And we changed to make sure that if we do a study, it's like, it's only applicable to students because we only sampled students, right? But what practitioners would do is they would take this thing and they say, this worked. This 3 positive things exercise is absolutely amazing. And it worked to increase happiness and decrease stress, depression, and anxiety for everybody. And they repackage it as if this thing is like the end all be all antibiotic for positive or to manage negativity, right? So they take things out of context and they sell it to you as if this is the end all and be all. What happens then? Unfortunately, the things don't work. And then what do you do? I tried this stuff, didn't work for me, bullshit. So then I start to lose faith in this thing because it doesn't work for me. So the cherry picking thing is a big issue. And also attached to that is the blowing things out of proportion aspect. So again, you over-exaggerate the results. The second thing is that regarding how things are positioned in such a way that they would take different types of interventions, let's say the gratitude visit or whatever, and they will package things that are unrelated to the thing that they're talking about and making it out as if it is related to that thing. For example, the gratitude visit, they would say, it really helps you to build better relationships at work, right? Not so much. But because there was one correlational study that showed a small correlation between gratitude and pro-social behavior, between gratitude and peer support at work. Now, they said that this intervention will help this because of that fact. which is not the case. I can't remember what the third thing is now. I want to make 3 points. It was the over-exaggeration, the cherry-picking, and the taking things out of context. Oh, and the last thing is about the population groups that are being used for these studies. Again, making sure that these things are actually applicable to you. So we talk about studies that's done to the general population or clinical context. Make sure that whatever you're reading is actually applicable to you. But how do you identify whether or not something is actually science-based, evidence-based, or not, from these self-help types of books and YouTube gurus, as an example? I'm thinking about the weight loss people now, as an example. None of them work for me. But I think one is also to check the sources yourself. Unfortunately, people make statements, but always just, if you find something interesting or valuable, it's going to take you 2 seconds to Google it. Just check the fact to make sure that the things that people are saying is actually applicable to you and will actually work for you. I think that's very important. To check the credentials of the person. That is also, I think, one of the things that I kind of like realized, and kind of like see if this person actually does have like a science background or so. And most people, for example, with PhDs, look at the stuff that they've done and what they've published on. Their thesis, just Google the guy or the girl and say thesis. And you if they did it at a university, for example, their stuff would be publicly available to also kind of like see if the things that they're saying is actually correct. 2, when people mention specific stuff and so in these books, as an example, they will say, Van Zyl and et al. Actually wrote this paper on these 10 techniques that you can use to whatever. Email the person. Ask questions. Academics love to talk about their stuff, right? So reach out to the original people. And if something sounds too good to be true, I think that's my last tip. If something sounds way too good to be true, it usually isn't. It usually is. So rather just take it for what it is, and be very critical of what you believe.
Yeah, I love that. That's very practical and I think useful for a lot of people. And I think, like, as a psych student myself, one of the things I'm most grateful for, even though I absolutely hated it at the time, was having a kind of statistical, foundation and being able to read and critique papers. And, I did a couple of like philosophy of science units in undergrad. And I think that really gives you a nice foundation. But I often feel for, people who don't have a science background, because, it's understandable that they might fall victim, I suppose, to the cherry picking, to the taking things out of context. But I think, advice like what you've just given and hopefully this podcast will help people to be able to sift through the BS that is out there. So, thank you for sharing that.
There's a very nice book. I just had to Google the author because I couldn't remember who wrote it. But it's a nice book by Darrell Huff called How to Lie with Statistics. And it's very simplistically written. It's very short. I think it's something like 100 pages or something. But it shows you how easy it is for people to lie with or change the narrative based on statistics. So you can think about, for example, they would say that there is like 11%. So we did the study and we evaluated people, and 11% of people believe that they're racially discriminated at work. And this is a massive problem. And then they would use the statistic as a mechanism to generate a massive narrative around it, or how to contrast things that aren't really related to each other. But I don't think, I don't understand physics, right? But when I read books, I don't have to have a very good understanding of physics to evaluate whether or not something feels or sounds right to me or not. In psychology, of course, it would be really good if you had some statistics and critical thinking courses that help you really think critically and ask questions. But one of the things I always ask myself is, why is this person stating what they're stating? That's the first question. And the second question is, what do they want to achieve? And that's the easiest way to think critically about something. Just asking the why, the why question, and what do they want to achieve by stating this thing. And if there is a larger value on, if I can blow this one statement out of proportion, right? Will it make me look better, or will it make the argument that I'm trying to present look better? Then there is unfortunately a probability that this is not an actual fact or something is being over-exaggerated. So that's kind of like always how I try to do it. Also, if a person not critical about their own writing. So, for example, we wrote this paper on this new model for this integrative model for well-being, for example, and there's a component in it called mindset, which kind of like showed, which is the end-all and be-all thing over the past 50 years about growth mindset and fixed mindset. And there's a recent meta-analysis kind of like showed that maybe that's not necessarily the case. So even with that, it's like, new paper we're writing is all about, but if this is really the case, being more critical on the stuff that we actually have written before and criticizing that and saying, actually, what we wrote there doesn't necessarily hold that much value, but we do believe there's value in the following. So a person, if they're writing a book, they have this ability, or a paper, have this ability to contrast different ideas, putting the two wolves in a cage and let them fight it out to kind of like show you that the reason why my wolf won is because it has a stronger argument. So I think that's another good idea to kind of see if something holds value or not, is to see if a person actually does talk about the opposite side or the criticism of something before they present their argument.
And I think on that note, if there's one thing I've learned in psychology and studying it over the last few years, is that there's very little that's black and white. There's just so much in the gray. There's so much that applies in one context which doesn't in another. So,
yeah.
Let's move to some discussion on PPIs now. You've kind of alluded to a few positive psychology interventions, the gratitude visit, for example. So I think the first question I want to ask on PPIs is, are there certain positive psychology interventions or PPIs that have a stronger evidence base than others, even in some contexts? Are there others that people may have heard of that are really not all they're made out to be?
So positive psychological intervention, I think it's important to note that these interventions are types of interventions that really focuses on enhancing positive state traits and behaviors. We utilize positive psychological approaches and theories as a mechanism to facilitate these positive state traits and behaviors. That's, I think, an important thing to realize. So there are, of course, various types, right? So if we look at the overall broad types of interventions, you have organizational level or community or society level, so group structural orientated interventions, right? Where you change the system, basically, because if you change the system, it can change the things for the group and the group for the individual. We also have interventions that are really based on the group itself. So think about trainings as an example, as a group-based intervention. So we train you on engagement or happiness or meaning. Then we have self-help type of interventions, which is more these what we call individual. The word eludes me now. It's too late. It's basically self-help interventions that you apply on yourself. Self-administered intentional activities. There we go. Self-administered intentional activities, basically self-help stuff. And then the final part is the fourth type of intervention is individual-orientated stuff, where it's like coaching, counseling, therapy, these types of things. So there's these four broad categories of interventions. Now, we do know that two of them work extremely well, right? We know structural orientated intervention. So think about changing the entire university and how it functions and to be more conducive to what students need. That is the most optimal, best way to help, for example, students with their well-being. Change the entire system, change the entire company, right?
Hello, everyone. Just a super quick break to let you know that if you have any comments or questions for Dr. van Zyl, shoot them through below and I'll send them through to him. Now, back to today's episode.
If we look at the second aspect that's very effective, is like having an individual-based, relationship-orientated thing with you. So like being in a counseling or a coaching session where everything is really structured around your needs and your environments. The problem is both of these things, highly effective, super expensive. So let's talk about the organizational level types of interventions. So we have to change the entire system. So think about implementing a whole new policy on well-being and wellness. So for example, implementing something that's saying we only work on a 4-day work week that you've seen is happening, like for example, in the Scandinavian countries and in Canada and some other countries. They kind of like showed this 4-day work week actually improve people's well-being without sacrificing performance. In some cases, the performance will be even slightly better. If you look at something like in hospitals, self-rostering as an example, where you give people the autonomy, nurses the autonomy to structure their tasks and their time that they have to go to work more, put it in their hands, increases well-being, increases mental health, helps people be more resilient. Super expensive to do and very difficult to change an entire system to implement these types of things, right? But it works. We know that. Change the environment works. The same thing with, for example, individual therapy. We know coaching helps. We understand helping you to identify your specific strengths and helping you set a development, figure out what your goals are and creating a plan to help you to get to those goals and coaching you every week, every month on how to get to those goals. Super effective. The problem is very expensive as well. And also the availability of this thing is very low. So we have very few therapists, for example, very few actually trained coaching psychologists. So the supply is very low, the demand is very high, and therefore we can't even match the needs. Therefore it costs so much. Whereas the interventions that are focused on groups, for example, so think about training, it is really cheap, very scalable. The problem is it's a one-size-fits-all model. It's like I'm assuming that your training, let's say you go do a mindfulness training somewhere, right? We presume that everybody there has the same needs, has the same level of background, the same inclination. And then all of a sudden, you might find value to it, maybe, but the other 50 participants not, especially like an organizational context where people are basically sometimes forced to go to these trainings and it's not useful to them. So nobody gets actual value because it's a general need that the company identified. And now we're trying to address it by putting everybody through this. And it's a very expensive exercise in that respect and not so effective. And then self-help activities down there, and then kind of like, no, it's things I like to do. These things do work. The problem is that you have to identify the right types of activities for you that's really specific to you. So they're cheap and effective, or free and effective, right? But the problem is like really figuring out the right stuff for you and how to align this to your strengths. That is another challenge. So these are the four broad stuff, and they're challenges, I think.
I love that last point you made about individualizing it to the person, and some interventions might work for some people and others not. I was talking to, on a previous episode, Matt Iarciello on mental wellbeing strategies. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a leading kind of wellbeing researcher in Australia. And he gave this term person to intervention fit. And that's the next kind of frontier in
person intervention fit.
Yeah, that's the next challenge for positive psychology to tackle. So are there certain variables, personality traits that lend PPIs better to some people than others?
I actually did I have this whole workshop that I do on positive organizational intervention design, right? To design these things. And person environment fit, person intervention fit is really important. And personalized interventions work a lot better than non-personalized, for example. So I think also Sonia Lubomierski and I think it was Sin. Yeah, it was Lubomierski and Laos in 2013. So basically, they came up with this model on person intervention fit. They basically said there are certain things like this, like activity features, features of the thing that you're designing that will influence the effectiveness, and there are person-oriented aspects that influences the effectiveness. So if you think about, I want to enhance well-being, and I have an intervention that I'm implementing, right? These things moderate. The person intervention fit moderates this relationship, right? So if we look at the activity things, there are things that happen inside of you. So think in terms of, so one of the things, for example, dosage. If you think of blood pressure medication as an example, you have to get the right dosage, right, to help that person to decrease their blood pressure. The same thing in psychological sciences and psychological interventions. We have to make sure that what we're doing in terms of the amount of it needs to be enough for that person to be able to actually see and feel a change. If we do a one quick coaching session, it's the first time and the only time that we ever meet, one quick coaching session, not going to help you. 10 might, 15 might even be better. 18 might be the peak, and you won't get any more benefit after that. But one session is not going to be enough. So you have to figure out what the actual dosage is of this intervention to make sure that it actually does have the effect that you kind of like want. We also have to make sure that you build variety into your activities. So my PhD, for example, I forced students to, so I did this gratitude thing that I created, the self-help thing, and I said like, okay, so for 30 days, go write down, every day go find something that you're grateful for 30 days. Yeah, after about 4 days, that activity became really tedious, right? The same thing over and over. Doesn't work. You have to build some variety into it to make sure, okay, maybe today on Monday you find something that's important for your family. On Tuesday, maybe with your friends. On Thursday, with whatever. So build variety into your activities in order to help people to actually utilize the stuff a little bit more. If I can remember, there's also things make sure that in terms of the activity thing, that there is some support in place. Even if it's a self-help activity, make sure that you build some social support network in there. We did an intervention a couple of years ago with Instagram and a group of people. So we kind of like asked people, we used Instagram and we used photo ethnography as a mechanism to help people to identify the things that are meaningful to them. So we asked them for over a period of a week, take a photo every day of something that you find extremely meaningful, post it on Instagram, and write 3 reasons why you found this activity meaningful. We had a group of about 50 odd people that went through it. And we kind of like found like after day 1, people started to engage a lot more with each other. They say, oh, you posted, I saw like for the past 2 days, you posted stuff with people, your family. Your family must be really important for you. So that social learning component also kind of helped people to continue with the activity. And we found over a year's time, after we measured them again over a year, that stress and anxiety, for example, went down, but not hysteric depression, and mental health increased. But that social component is really important. Then I think also on the activity side, you also have to have this focus between managing stuff in the past, accentuating the things that you're having in the present, and having some future-orientated respect. So if we think about something like coaching as an example, it is growth-orientated, so we focus on future-orientated things, but we're dealing with the here and now. So who are you, what are your strengths, and etc. But we utilize stuff that's happened to you in your past for you to identify, for example, what your strengths are. So there needs to be this continuation of, oh, I actually am very creative, or I was very creative in my past, which means I can actually activate that now. And how can I utilize that creativity now to help me to do something in the future? So that's more on the activity features. On the personal orientated features, there's many things, for example, that impact. So think, for example, your motivation of, can I actually change? I have a little bit of a weight issue. So I want to lose weight, right? I have lost a lot of weight before, so I know I can do it, but I'm not really motivated, but I want to lose weight. That's a lot of effort, but I know I can. So even though I have the capabilities, I have the skills and etc., if I'm not motivated to do it, I'm probably not going to do it. Also, if I feel that the thing that we're going to do is not going to help, I remember during my internship, efficacy beliefs, during my internship, we have to go through a lot of therapy ourselves to become a therapist as well in South Africa. So I remember I went through like one of the sessions, and we're trained from this humanistic perspective, this Rogerian approach, which is like you're the center of your universe. I understand things from your perspective, and then there's this certain flow that takes place. And I can't remember the exact wording, but let's just say the person says like, "Oh, and how did that make you feel?" And I was like, "Oh my, no." The moment that she said that, yeah, I was out of it. I'm like, yeah, this is not going to work. This is not going to have any effect, is it? So my efficacy beliefs then also influenced the effectiveness of this intervention. You can also think about things like a person's age as another thing, right? And personal characteristics like that. So you can't have a fully online, interactive, AI-driven app to help people with happiness because it works, but you're giving it to 80-year-olds. It's not gonna work. You must make sure that the intervention you're designing is applicable to the group that you are assessing. Personality characteristics, also very important. As you know, people that are more diligent is more in line to do things. I'm very I'm very creative, but I'm also very flexible in a way. On the MBTI, I'm like a INFP, so perceiving type, so I'm all over the place. Do not tell me to do something in a structure, in a routine, everything. I'm not going to do it. I am not going to do it. For a person that is very structured, and you tell them to just go out for the next week and just go do something that you feel is meaningful, they're going to hate it, right? So this personality characteristic also plays a role. And I think the last thing that's on the person features that's important is your whole idea about your intention to treat. That's something that in positive psychology we're not really addressing at the moment, is that you can, again, the motivation might be there and the efficacy beliefs and these things you spoke about, but if I really inherently do not want to change the thing that I want to say, so I know I need to lose weight, I know it's important, etc., but there's no way that I'm going to do it. There's no way that I'm going to action it. It's also going to fail. So you have to structure these interventions in such a way that it does meet, that's personalized, but also takes into consideration these activity features, the things that you are designing, but also incorporating the individualistic or the individual's strengths and goals and etc. One last thing, if I may. So when I do this specific to demonstrate this, for this workshop, what I let people do beforehand is I give them these 4 techniques: the gratitude visit, the three positive things, our activity with the photos, and the pro-social thing, the 5 random acts of kindness on one day. So I let them do that beforehand, and I let them complete the VIA strengths inventory to identify what their strengths are. And in the workshop, I let them come, and because I already know whose strengths are associated with who, so I make these little tables, and I basically put these tables up, and I say 2 people are contrasting. So let's say we do the gratitude visit. So I put someone that has gratitude in the first column and someone that has something totally opposite on the other end. So I don't know, social intelligence. And then I ask them firstly, on a scale of 1 to 10, how easy was this activity for you? So the gratitude people would be like, oh, it was so easy. I do this every day. It gave me the opportunity. And the other guy would be like, yeah, it took a lot of energy for me. And then the other question I kind of like ask is like, how do you think this activity, this thing kind of like fit with you? And they say, oh, it's totally me and etc. And how valuable it was. So then we reflect upon it and we kind of like realized that people that are, if the activity that you're doing, so the gratitude visit, if you give it to the person that has gratitude as a strength, they're going to get more benefit out of it. It's going to enhance their mental well-being and et cetera, et cetera. But for the other person, it's going to either do nothing or have a negative effect. So I like to do that in those interventions as well, as a mechanism to show this person intervention fit.
Oh, it's so crucial, the points you're making. I think positive psychology interventions have such potential particularly in preventative mental health. And I think, for example, in Australia, there's this more and more statistics coming out, particularly after COVID, but even before COVID, showing the burden of mental illness upon our healthcare system, and it's under some pretty significant strain here in Australia. But the public health conversations seem to be around, okay, how can we fix treatment? How can we fix treatment? And obviously that bears a huge amount of importance. But if there are preventative measures that can be used, and if they can be harnessed in a way such that we personalize these interventions so that people are adhering to them longer term, and therefore actually seeing the benefits longer term for their mental health, and potentially preventing future incidences of mental illness, I think that can have a huge impact upon society and the mental illness and mental health burden that many societies globally are facing.
What I really like about what you're saying is like, what I kind of realized, because I come from South Africa. I'm originally from South Africa, but I've been living in the Netherlands for many years now. And what I see is that there's a major difference in the healthcare system, which includes the psychological healthcare system, about preventative versus promotive care. And in South Africa, for example, they included, most of the insurance agencies have implemented like these wellness programs that's like, if you walk 10,000 steps a day, you get X amount of points. If you do these psychological activities like meeting with your friends, blah, blah, blah. So there's all of these activities you can basically do. You get like these points, and these points either lower your premiums or they give you other benefits. Like you can go to the movies for free, or so they kind of, because they know that if I do these things, right, me as a healthcare insurer, I'm not doing this because I want you to be healthy. No, I want to do this because I want to save me costs. Because if you're healthier, it's going to reduce the amount, it's going to reduce the probability of you going to have to get care, which means I'm going to have to pay a lot less and less often for you to go through psychotherapy or go through an MRI scan or whatever the case might be. So they understand the value of this, where in Europe, that's not necessarily the case. And specifically with regards to mental health stuff, and we're in the infancy in mental health preventative care. So I've really, with the exclusion of South Africa and some stuff in the US, I've really not seen anything that's providing group sessions for, I don't know, talking about expats have issues, get expats together and talk about your issues, or having things in place that actually provides people with a personalized intervention program. So do some assessment and figure out where you're at, and figuring out what activities you can do to kind of like help you function better in that new society, or how to integrate better. So I haven't really seen these types of things. So there's a massive need, which means there's a massive market.
I can't wait to see, the potential of that being unlocked with PPI research, which is why I think what you're doing, Llewellyn, is so important. I want to talk about applying your research and the PPIs to different populations, and we've been talking about the mental illness burden upon for example, healthcare systems in different countries, and a lot of the statistics I'm seeing are that 15 to 25-year-olds are in particular at risk of anxiety, depressive disorders. So you've looked at the application of PPIs to university and college populations, right? And a particular study I liked that you did, Flourishing 2.0, a practical guide for students, I think was the title. Yeah. Can you talk us through some of the implications of that for students listening, or even, parents of people in that kind of age range, as to how they can go about improving mental health outcomes at what can be a really difficult time?
So in that specific paper, but kind of like very practically, over the past 20 odd years, my colleague is a very old professor at university and stuff. They, for example, did that work, and the things that we kind of like showed, like research kind of like showed that it really does have an impact. So we looked at all these activities that we've done, and we kind of like slotted it into the PERMA model. So Seligman's original model on flourishing, it says flourishing is a function of positive emotions, P, engagement, E, R, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. So that PERMA model. So we kind of looked at what are some of the activities that people can do to help them feel better, function better, and fit in a little bit more. So in terms of the whole positive emotion thing, we kind of know we can't build lasting happiness on that, because people adapt to things. But it's important to kind of savor these positive moments. So for example, things that students can do by themselves, which I like, not programs or whatever, is we kind of like know that just expressing gratitude to other students for things that they're doing, just, oh, thank you so much, it really means the world to me. Something as simple as that affects my level of well-being, because it helps me build a stronger relationship with a person. We also know that we kind of like know if you have this growth-oriented mindset, we can kind of like learn from your mistakes, and not necessarily see a mistake as a problem, but rather opportunity to learn. That also kind of like helps you to function better. And how do we do this? We kind of like take this as a scenario that, let's say I did very badly on a test. I can put this down and say like, but why did I do badly on this test? Like looking at all the, maybe I studied a lot, maybe I studied the wrong content, maybe my learning style is not so efficient, right? If I can really figure out what the actual issue is, I can address it. But if I also found that, oh, I actually did my absolute best, what I possibly could do, if I get that 65% or that 6.5 or whatever the rating scale is, but I knew I studied for weeks on end and I did my absolute best, you can also feel proud of yourself in that respect, because there was nothing else you could possibly have done differently. Maybe it's just not your field of study. What else? Also, what's really important is that in that case, savor the positive things that happen. So when something positive happens to you at university, or you do something that you actually like, try to savor it, try to be in that moment, be mindful of the things that you actually do like, because if you're mindful of it, that experience feels a lot longer. I do this thing with chocolates, where I usually give a person, a group of people, like a chocolate, and I say, eat the first one as fast as possible. And the person that eats it fastest wins something. And then I ask them, okay, what chocolate was it? And then people say it was sweet. Maybe it was milk chocolate. I don't know. And then we do the same exercise, and I give them the same chocolate, and I say, okay, like a 5-minute thing. We open it, we feel it, we open it slowly, we take it out, we smell it, we put it in the mouth, we don't chew it, we let it melt. And then after that, we ask them for the question, what chocolate did you have and how was it? And their experience is totally different. Tastes a lot better. They feel the nuance, they get more benefit out of it. And the same principle applies to life. So that's all about some tips on doing, on enhancing your positive state and getting some exercise, of course. In terms of engagement, that moment kind of like where you feel you're lost in that moment, like time just goes by like this with your friends. So how do we kind of accentuate or enhance that? Some techniques that we kind of like found work was setting very realistic goals for yourself and try to commit to achieving these. Figuring out what your strengths are, figuring out the things that you're really good at, and applying them more actively in your work. So let's say you do a group work exercise, for example, and your strength is leadership. Maybe take control of the situation, right? Facilitate the group to get to the outcome. If it's creativity, like figure out creative ways to solve these problems. But figure out what you're really good at and figure out how can I utilize those things a lot more in my tasks, in my hobbies, in my schoolwork, or my university work. What I also like to do here, attached to that realistic goal thing, is having a very set plan for the year. To say by the end of the year, like I want to have got an 80% average. I want to have made 2 new friends, and etc. Have this growth plan in place with certain check-in points, right? So have SMART goals with certain check-in points for yourself over a period of time this year to see how you're actually progressing on these things. What else? I think if we then go to, I think that's PER, to the relationship part. Here is quite something I'm quite interested in. So do you know how to form relationships? Do you know what the most important aspect about forming relationships are?
The most important? Okay, let me take a guess. I would say some sort of common value set between the two people.
Okay, how do we get to that common value set? So you set 2 people around the table that don't know each other. How do you identify that? What do you do?
I suppose you engage in discussion and talk, right?
But talk about what? Are we talking about the weather? We talk about...
Well, I mean, you could build a relationship like that, but it'd be pretty superficial.
It won't be a relationship. You won't get benefit from that.
Yeah.
For all of your listeners, the most important thing is systematic self-disclosure. So if you go out on a date, right, ask questions, but getting the point, but it's not just like me asking questions about you, because then you, at one point, you will feel that's very one-sided. And I know a lot of you, and you're going to withdraw and you're going to close off. But it's like you say a little bit about yourself, and I go a little bit deeper about me, and then I ask you a question about something. And so it's a systematic sharing of information, personal information, to the point where it gets to this deeper kind of level. But it's a systematic process. So figuring out how to do that, really important. Again, I really struggled with this during my internship, and like my entire life, up until I was like 22. I'm really good at building relationships now, of course, but I was really bad at it. And then my supervisor psychologist would like walk in every morning into my office, and he would be like, "Hi, you. How are you?" And I would be like, "Good, thank you. And you, prof?" And he'd be like, "Why do you want to know?" And oh my lord, that like this tall social anxiety and this old man walks in and like very serious, like, "Why do you want to know?" I'm like, I'm so sorry. I was just asking you, and you would be like, "Oh, so you really don't really care. You just asked it for the sake of asking." And it caught me off guard so much at that stage, and I felt like so anxious. And I was like, "I'm so sorry," but he made it from a caring perspective, and he was very funny and very sharp, and he was very competitive. So the next day it would go on for months, and the next day would come in, and the same narrative. It's like, "Hi, Lou, how are you?" And good, thanks to you, professor. And he'd be like, "Why do you want to know?" And then the last night I would read up on, I don't know, emotional intelligence. And I'm like, "Professor, maybe it's only people with low emotional intelligence that asks these questions, that want to know, or low self-esteem. And then you would have a very sharp, very snappy comeback to me. But it forced me to develop these skills, to engage. And it became over time because he knew that I'm very competitive. So he knew that from me because we spoke about it, and he utilized that as a means to help me to learn the skill. But that comes from me talking a little bit more about myself and feeling trust that he would not have not having something negative in his back mind to try and mess me over. So that systematic self-disclosure part was important there. But building these relationships that are mutually beneficial is extremely important. And that's why I'm saying, for example, having conversations with people that are meaningful, that have depth, is important. Use active listening. Do you know what active listening is? Active listening and responding? So it's like listening, paraphrasing, asking questions, reflecting how you're feeling, understanding the person's emotion. So utilizing active listening as a means, because that will make the other person feel more heard, and they'll give a lot more. Doing acts of kindness, of course, is important. But also on the other end, we're speaking about positive things here about building these relationships. But it's also important to have very clear boundaries and communicating your boundaries clearly from the beginning, because otherwise you get violated in a way and you don't really say anything. So it also negatively affects that relationship. So some techniques and tools there. In terms of meaning is the difficult one, because it's very difficult to kind of like cultivate meaning. But like with that activity that we did with the photos, it's important to reflect upon the sources of meaning in your life and understanding why these things are meaningful to you. Because if you understand what is meaningful and why it's meaningful to you, when you go through a difficult time, it's easier for you to go into those things. So some people, for example, found time with friends and family is important. Some people found connection with nature as something else. So if you know what these things are and you're going through a difficult time, it's easier for you to go do these things or engage in those activities, because that will refill your cup. For example, that was the meaning thing. And I think that the last thing about accomplishments, which is really about, let's say, for example, you want to learn how to become a concert pianist, right? That's your absolute goal, but you're starting from scratch now, and you want to say within a week, I want to be this concert pianist. It's not going to work. You are going to, the distance between the skill that you want to learn and your current capability is so large that if you really believe that, you will learn something, but it's not going to be anywhere near there. And therefore, you're going to fall a lot lower in terms of your well-being, because you did not accomplish that thing. So the idea here is to have challenges and things that's just a little bit higher than your current skill set. Because if you do something that you're really good at the moment, right? Let's say I'm really good at statistics, I do the correlations every day. I'm going to be engaged because I do something that I'm good at, but it's not really going to challenge me. So it's not going to make me happy. So I have to put the thing that I want to achieve just a little bit higher, the difficulty than what I'm currently at, so that it forces me to learn new things, so I can feel that I've accomplished something. So setting these challenging goals becomes absolutely important. What's also important in terms of the enhancing this accomplishment thing is to have these realistic goals, but also communicate it to people that are important for you, because you do need cheerleaders. You do need the people that's standing behind you with the rah-rahs and saying, oh, you can't do this, and etc. when you're learning a new skill. But you need these same people that when you're competent in it, they can provide you with critique. They say, oh, maybe you can do this a little bit better, maybe that's a little bit differently, so that you can also learn from it. And then finally, I think what's important there is ask for continuous feedback. And then something that Carol Dweck spoke about the deliberate practice. So if you heard something about the 10,000 hour rule,
mastery.
It's not a valid, again, another fallacy in psychology. Just doing something for 10,000 hours is not going to make you an expert in it. Doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting a different result is going to drive you insane. Albert Einstein. Same thing. But if I do something and I know there's this one area that I'm really bad at in this big thing that I want to learn, and I practice on that thing, and I figure out what I'm doing wrong, deliberate practice, spending hours on that thing, that will enhance my capability, and that will make me feel like I've accomplished something later. So these are some practical tools and tips from that original paper of ours that people can kind of like do to try and, or students can do to kind of help them grow and develop.
Yeah, and in that particular paper, I think the outcomes were, yes, augmented mental health, but also this can have an impact on academic performance, which, might be an extremely important value for people listening. There's that relationship between the two, right? Your mental well-being, and I think literally it was self-reported academic performance was one of the variables you looked at in that study.
So that was a different study. That paper was just like the tools and techniques, but you are right. So there's a very strong relationship between mental health and academic performance. So why does the university spend so much time, effort, and money to have counselors on campus and to have all of these activities and things? But it's not to help you, because they don't care about you. They care about throughput. They care about you performing, because if you perform and you pass the degree, they get money from the government, right? The subsidies. So they're spending this time to help you in that respect, because we know a mentally healthy student performs a lot better, and if they perform a lot better in their academic work, they're more likely to complete their degrees, which is important for us. So from the company perspective, for you, the same thing applies. If you're mentally healthy, if you know what your strengths are and able to utilize those things a lot more, building these aspects, good relationships, and etc., you're going to perform a lot better in your schoolwork.
Well, I love the very practical tools that you outlined, particularly the meaningful conversation and systematic self-disclosure. That's probably the favorite of mine that you listed there. But I'm seeing more and more of these kind of packaged into courses at university, wellbeing courses. We have one at ANU where I'm at, and it's one of the most popular courses. It's available to anyone across the uni. You don't have to be in the psychology faculty. I think the most popular course ever, I'm pretty sure, at Yale was Laurie Santos's The Science of Wellbeing, which again is very much looking at like practical behaviors like you just outlined that can augment mental well-being. Do you see value in this with respect to the outcomes we just talked about of that kind of 15 to 25-year-old university students being at risk of mental health? Do you see these kind of particular courses that are packaged with these PPIs or with these particular kind of well-being behaviors being able to meaningfully impact that mental illness kind of rates in that age group?
Can I ask you a question with an activity?
Okay.
So in 30 seconds, do you have a piece of paper in front of you?
I do, yeah.
In 30 seconds, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to time you. You're going to write down everything. I'm not going to ask you to share it, don't worry, but you're going to write down everything that's wrong with you, right?
Okay.
Everything.
Yeah.
So, psychologically, physically, whatever. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds. In 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's one. Yeah. I'll take solace in the fact that I'm finding it hard to think of things.
Okay, stop. How many did you have?
I got 5.
Okay, 5. Okay, so in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to ask you to write down everything that is freaking amazing and awesome and excellent in you, right? Your best characteristics. Okay. Yeah. So in 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay.
Stop.
Okay.
How many did you have?
A lot more than 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
That is a first, but it's also probably sample bias because you're hosting a website, a podcast on Wellbeing. But you just disproved my point. Outlier proves the point.
Oh, okay.
But we kind of find that people, you're more conditioned to identify the things that are wrong in you than you are to find the things that are good in you, right? And to become more conscious of this fact, and to help you to figure out the things that are good in you is really important. That's why I think things in this course are so crucial, because you are trained to figure out the things that are negative in you. What is the one word that a kid between the ages of 2 months and 6 years hears the most? The one word.
Naughty? I don't have kids, so I don't
naughty,
know.
Yeah, naughty, no. Mia, 9. No.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
No,
I see.
no is because it trains us from that age to find everything that's dangerous, that things we should not supposed to be doing, and etc. So we become experts in our lives in finding these things. We do not become experts in identifying the things that are good in us, identifying the stuff that's important for us. So you have to become conscious and cognizant of this, because we don't get these skills from our parents. Unfortunately, we don't get these skills in high school. So we learn these things systematically as we grow older. If we had this a lot more earlier in life, it would be amazing. But now, if they start implementing these things in university, they're giving the skills and capabilities you need to be able to help you in this next phase, very important phase of your life, going to work or going to do a master's or whichever route you're going to take. So I think it's imperative to incorporate these elements into courses, but not to the effect where it becomes a burden to the student, because then it will have a negative effect.
So I would love to see this implemented even in high schools, which is obviously also such a challenging time. I'm sure it is somewhere in Australia, but I don't know if it's being implemented anywhere. But these, again, practical courses which you can offer to people, and they can have the autonomy to select it. But I think that'd be so useful coming into that age range where you really are at risk of so many mental illness and adverse mental health outcomes. I think that'd be fantastic. And again, systemic kind of wide approach that I think would meaningfully move the needle and the statistics on a societal level.
Yeah, I do think so. I think I'm not sure if it's still running though, but the biggest positive psychological intervention that was ever run was like in the beginning of the 2000s, and it was in Australia. It was the Penn University Penn State resiliency program implemented in schools back then. Not sure if that's still running, but I thought that was a good attempt on a larger scale.
Okay, yeah. So the other kind of context that I feel like you've done a lot of work looking at the application of these PPIs is POP, or positive organizational psychology, right? And you came up with this framework, the PERMA +4 framework, or I don't know if you yourself established that, but you certainly looked at that in a level of depth. Can you talk us through those 9 elements and perhaps how they apply in an organizational context?
I guess there's 2 questions. The one is kind of like what this model is, and then see how interventions kind of like run in organizations, right?
Yeah.
So some of these, okay. So we kind of like I mentioned before, most of the models that we have is very much individualistic focused, right? We kind of like look at you and the stuff that's going on inside of you, but we don't necessarily look at the things that's going on around you, your environment, as a mechanism that also kind of like facilitates it. So in the Seligman kind of like wrote this paper in 2018 addressing some of these criticisms and saying that the PERMA model is only like a baseline model of elements attributing to well-being, but isn't well-being itself. And it's open to adding new components to it if it meets certain criteria, right? And he gave some criteria. Right. So with this kind of like in mind, the idea is to say, like, how do you expand the stuff that's inside of you by incorporating things from the environment? So my colleague, Stuart Donaldson, and his son, Scott, went, I think just the year before we wrote this paper, and they went and they had this big questionnaire, and they wanted to validate a flow questionnaire that kind of like looks at all of the different elements that are actually attributing to well-being. That's not just in the individual themselves, right? And they came up with some extra categories, and we reclustered them and recategorized them in such a way into the PERMA model now as a mechanism to say, like, we've got the 5 elements, the positive emotions, engagement, meaning, relationships, and accomplishments. We have that. But now incorporating the elements that's attached to the environment, right? So the 2 things that we kind of like found that was really important from is, one, if you are not in a financially secure position, so I think if you can't pay your medical bills in the US as an example. If it's not good, you're not going to function well, right? You're not going to be able to address your basic inherent physiological and psychological needs, so you won't be able to flourish. So we kind of identified economic security or financial security as a very important aspect of that. We also understand that the environment that you work, so not just the psychosocial environment, but also the physical environment in which you're functioning, plays a massive role in terms of your well-being. So I think, for example, there's a lot of studies on lighting now, also at our university, about the impact of lighting on burnout, as an example. So kind of like looking at different, if light fluctuates during the day, what type of light influences and etc., and how does this impact your psychological characteristics, or air quality as an example. So and temperature. So there's a lot of these things that you can think about, but also think about people in mines as an example, right? Darkness, underground, confined spaces, or people working in nuclear plants. So there are these environmental factors that also plays a very important role. So both on the physical, but also on the psychosocial. So if I work in an apartment that's not very supportive, that doesn't really care about me, that criticizes me, and etc., so that environment is also not conducive to my performance. So environment then plays a role. We also then looked at two other things. So again, my physical health, doesn't matter what's going on up here, we know healthy body, healthy mind, right? Fundamental principle. If you're depressed, go for a walk, go outside, do some exercise, releases endorphins, makes you feel better, gets more oxygen into the blood, increases dopamine, oxytocin. So physical health is really important as another element of mental health and well-being. So that was another element. And then finally, we looked at to say, well, what is the thing that's missing in this respect? And like I've mentioned earlier about the whole mindset thing, is that we kind of like thought like, but you have to have a growth-orientated mindset to kind of like know that I can actually have the skills and the capabilities to actually change. And having that type of growth mindset, seeing problems as solutions, seeing problems as opportunities to learn, etc. This is another aspect. This mindset is an element that attributes to well-being. And we have the questionnaire, and it does relate how it's supposed to relate. But these are the 9 elements then of our model of positive organizational well-being. PERMA at work plus physical health, positive mindset or growth mindset, good environment, and financial security or economic security, depending on how you see it.
Hello, everyone. Just a super quick break from today's episode to ask for a favor. If you are getting value from the Mental Wellbeing Show, either from today's episode or other episodes or clips, I would be super grateful if you were to hit subscribe, as this is how I continue to grow the show and communicate well-being, science, and evidence-based strategies out to the community. Thanks, and now back to the discussion.
There are, again, like I mentioned before, the same interventions as 4 categories. The organizational structure, group training, individual and self-help things are applicable, and we've done a couple of them. One of the biggest things that we've kind of had the opportunity to do is running talent development centers for very large petrochemical companies in the world. So basically, we kind of like figured out what is leadership. So it's a combination between individual coaching and group-orientated intervention. So it's a combination of these two, where we figured out we've got different levels of leadership within the company. So let's say we've got the president, the vice presidents, the directors, and etc. And we figured out what the capabilities are required at each level of this hierarchy in order for them to perform, right? So we do interviews, we do job shadowing, we look at documentation, and etc. and etc. So we figure out exactly the capability profile, the competency profile that's important for these people at these different levels. Then we develop a mechanism to assess this. So to assess these capabilities, both with psychological assessments, through simulations, development activities. So we create an assessment process. So let them do that, the questionnaires at home, and we do the competency-based assessments on a day or two within, in a day or two. So we assess people. So if you're a vice president, we presume that you are 100% doing the things that you're supposed to be doing. Otherwise, you would not be in that position. So we assess you based on the capabilities of the next level of leadership. So, for example, president. If you're vice president, we assess you on the president's capabilities, because if he leaves, we need to figure out who's the best person to kind of, for example, put in there, and also help you with your career trajectory. So we assess you based on that capability, take you through this. We have career interviews, for example, as well. And then we help you to set this development plan and coach you for 6 months on the different elements that you need in order to kind of develop. So that's a leadership capability approach where we really focus on your strengths. So we identify the strengths as part of the assessments, and we incorporate this into each one of these developmental types of activities that you kind of do. So that's one type of group/individual based intervention. Colleagues of ours, for example, also did this job crafting thing where you kind of help people to rephrase and rethink about your work and figuring out how to optimize the resources that you have, managing the demands and things that are too much on you, figuring out ways how to cope with that, but also figuring out how to get more resources and how to also function better at work. And organizational structure, things like implementing these policies, for example, like I've mentioned, or implementing a new wellness approach, which we also done in a financial company in Australia, in South Africa, where we helped them to set up a whole wellness department from scratch to help them to identify, because they worked in a very, I can't really talk about the population group, but it was a very highly stressful, highly dangerous type of work. And we kind of found that people would take a lot of risks in this type of work in order to mitigate or to cut the time down of the things that they needed to do, for example. So because of this, they were violating various health and safety rules and regulations and laws and stuff. So we implemented this wellness program to give them an opportunity to kind of, to talk about the things that they kind of they needed. So we had psychological services there, we had wellness stuff, we had coaches and etc. So this whole department, but it caused this company to set up a whole department and have a whole policy just to manage this thing in order to manage the risk that they are having. So that's another organizational level intervention that could be implemented.
Well, I love you've made that point a couple of times now in organizations, the importance of kind of structural change to have meaningful impact. And it's not something that I'd considered before. And if I'm honest, coming into our conversation today, one of the skepticisms, if you like, that I had was, how do you apply these PPIs to massive organizations and have meaningful, sustained change? But it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the key to that is to not just implementing a PPI one and done type approach, but to have structural, longer term systemic change.
So again, like I've mentioned, the easy in terms of the most effective way to do is to change the system, right? It's the easiest way to have sustainable change. Unfortunately, how are you going to do that with a Deloitte, a Shell, a National Reserve Bank, right? You're not going to change that system. It's not going to work and they're not going to permit you. So the thing is we have to figure out at which level we have the most impact. And we kind of know the most important thing is that people don't leave organizations, they leave managers. So if we can help, and if a manager invests in your development and they care and they kind of help to support you in your way, that is where we have the most bang for our buck. That's where if we invest money, for example, to help enhance leadership capability, to help teach them the importance of investing in people's development, to understand, to support, to facilitate the growth of their people, that's where we get the most value from in terms of dollar given versus value gotten, right? So if we can help managers, for example, and teach them, it's going to be, that's how you get the most effective change in the smaller group, right? But you can also look at the same principles about personal intervention, fit, and etc. applies to groups and companies as well. So in any company, if you go do a climate study, you walk into the company and you say, okay, ladies and gentlemen, what's wrong with it? What's wrong here? Climate study and psychological assessment of what's wrong, putting your hand on the pulse. They will always say communication issues. Always, right? Not in one case that I've done a lot of consulting work, have I found that communication is an issue. It's not, communication is a symptom. It's an outcome of an actual deeper orientated process. So, right? So we have to ensure that we address the right thing. And usually these things are to do with interpersonal relationships in groups. So people in the group don't work very well together, or the manager is very toxic, but there's something in the department or in the group that's causing the actual issue. And if it's a group-orientated thing, very easy. Not easy, but I mean, what we could do is we could facilitate sessions like growth groups to kind of talk about the issues that we have and to figure out ways that we can optimize it, utilizing something like appreciative inquiry as a mechanism for people to figure out what's already working very well in this group and how can we utilize these things to help us to get to the things that we want to go. If we talk about if there's issues between two specific people or two specific groups, we can do a psychological contract where we can sit down and we can clarify expectations with one another. Do this with your girlfriend every 6 months. To sit down and say, what do I expect of you? Make a list and we talk about it. What do you expect of me? Make a list. And what do we both expect of this project, this relationship, this role, this company, this department, or whatever the context is in which these people facilitate or find themselves. By clarifying those expectations, we kind of align what I think I need to do and what my manager thinks or my partner thinks I need to do. And therefore, I'm more inclined to feel a little bit better because now that air is cleared, because that's where sometimes the issues come. Same thing in a group setting. So I think most bang for your buck, to summarize, changing the system. Unfortunately, in 99.9% of the cases, that's not going to work. Focus on leadership. If that doesn't work, identify the core problem in the group and structure your intervention around the problem, not the symptom.
Okay, yeah. You mentioned consulting work that you do as well with these organizations. I am very curious. I'm doing a placement at the end of the year as part of my master's with an organizational psychology company here in Sydney. One thing I'm curious about is what is the motivation behind the companies that engage you for your services? Is it more of really, I want this to trickle down to my bottom line? Is it, no, I genuinely care about the well-being of my employees, or is it a combination of both, just from your experience?
You're asking two questions, and I first want to answer the second one. The first one. The first one is like people bring you in to solve a problem that they can't solve. That's why you're there, right? They say, we have all of these issues, please come and help us. That's why you are there, the fundamental element. If you look at it from a more structural perspective, the company really doesn't care about you. Just like the university, the company doesn't care. They're not going to spend, like this other company I spoke about with the wellness center, it's a lot of money in South African context, but it was around 100,000 euros to implement this center. That's a lot of money that you're putting into something. Not because I care about the people. No, it's because one, I want to mitigate a massive risk that I have. And the risk is a lot more than 100,000 euros to me. So implementing this will manage that risk, lower it, and therefore I basically get this return on investment in the things that I'm doing. So unfortunately, I don't really think companies care. They do care about, as in the structure, as in the building, as in the shareholders. They care about their performance and their bottom line, right? And they want to do anything possible to kind of maintain that. On a more psychosocial level, there are always issues. There are always things that kind of like hamper how we interact with each other. And that, in effect, if we can't work together and we are forced to work together on a project, that project is not going to go well. So let's coach, let's clarify, let's get these people together, let's clarify expectations, let's create a positive climate, because that way, everything will be fine in our apartment again. You will feel better, I will feel better, and we'll get the project done. That's usually 99% of the cases. That's how it goes.
Okay, that's interesting to hear.
Just one thing, they will tell you something different.
I can imagine they would, yeah. That's interesting to hear because just on a personal level, like, one of the reasons I got into psychology is I want to have an impact. And then knowing that these companies, it sounds like really they're just after improvement of their bottom line and more the work-related outcomes rather than employees' well-being. And I'm not sure how that really sits with me. Is that something that wrestles, with your conscience or keeps you up at night or no?
So I think that the big thing is like you do have this impact, right? And they will get you in because they want to solve this problem. They want to create something new. They want to help their people be better, because if they're better, it means that we're going to perform better, right? That's the idea. Like I mentioned, the back of this, they're not going to give money to do something if they're not going to get a return on investment. That's the big thing. But you will still have an impact. And the mindset is that there's still growth, there's still development taking place. And from your perspective, there's another issue which I maybe want to talk about in a minute, about the ethics attached to it, because you have this mindset, for example, between who's your client? Is it the person that you're seeing, or is it the company that's paying you? There's also that dynamic taking place. But in effect, it's about, no, I forgot what I say. I forgot what I was saying now. It was about the impact and the meaning. But you're the person that's as the consultant. Your goal is to address that problem, and that problem is to create a positive climate, or to create a strategy for these managers to have better relationships with their people, or whatever the case might be. So it is still a growth-orientated approach, right? You're still making impact. You're still seeing people grow and develop. You're still attributing to their lives, but it's your focus and the focus of the manager that's important there. The company, the building, is the one that doesn't care. The building wants to make money, right? The people inside it might be different, and I want to have good relationships and good working environment, etc. But the building, the shareholders, they just want to see their business grow. They want to get their return on their investment. They want to see turnover, not staff turnover, financial turnover, and profit increase over time.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Never thought of it like that. That makes sense. Even though they may be engaging you for one reason, you are still having a meaningful impact on well-being ultimately, by the sounds of it. So,
yeah.
And you mentioned there's ethics of engaging with these companies, who the clients actually are. So, yeah, can you elaborate?
That's a very, that's the thing that organizational psychologists, I think, struggle with a lot, because let's say, for example, I'm the issue in my department, right? And I'm being sent to you as my coach because my manager phones you or HR phones you and says, listen, Indy, come, this guy's making so many issues, he doesn't stop talking, whatever the case might be, fix him, right? So you come, and now you have this dual obligation, because I am the product, I am the thing that you are working with, right? But my boss is the one that's paying you, right? So, but my boss wants feedback. They're paying for the service. They want to know what's going on, or whatever the case might be. They want to influence you, to influence me in a certain way, or whatever. So you're sitting with this struggle, like, who's your actual client? Who's the person that you should actually focus on, and who's whose worth you need to value, whose value is more important for you in this relationship, right? And that is always a massive ethical dilemma, and it's in every situation you will come across that. So an HR person would say, "Oh, so how's things going with X?" I say, "Oh, it's going very well." Yeah, actually, I haven't seen that much. Like, he's still talking a lot. He's still I think he's very narcissistic. What do you think? Or they will try to get more information out of you, or whatever the case might be, because for them, it's they want to have this problem solved, right? And they have a certain idea of how they want it solved, and they're the one that's paying you. So they're thinking you're the one that's on their side, basically. And the client also thinks, you're listening to me, you're helping me, we've got this relationship, you're on my side. So whose side are you? And that's always a very delicate balance, because you have an obligation towards the company for reporting, to say, oh, things are going A, B, and C, but also have responsibility to me to make sure, because it's a relationship. And you can only disclose what me as the client, have agreed upon with you to disclose. And I think that's where the thing comes in. So asking me, for example, what's okay, what's not, clarifying the boundaries, and etc. And doing the same thing with the company. And I think what I always do at the end of this process, I would always have the people around the table. So I would have HR, the manager, the line manager, and the client around the table. And we'll talk about how things are going. We will clarify expectations there. I'll facilitate the session that way, because that way I feel at least that that loop is closed, and the report that I will write, the feedback report, which they always ask, will be based on that conversation, not based on any of the stuff that we've done before, but will be based on the things that's kind of came out of that.
That's a fascinating ethical dilemma for everyone involved as well, because I'm sure there'd be concerns on the employee's perspective in that case, the one who talks too much in that scenario, as to, well, what can I disclose to you? Where's this going to go, right?
Yeah, it's also about trust. It's always about trust. But yeah, there's actually, if Aaron Jordan, if you go to the International Journal of Wellbeing, I think last year they started creating these practice guidelines, also ethical guidelines for positive psychologists and positive psychological practices. And I think there's a small area in there about these types of ethical stuff as well. So I thought that's a good read also for your listeners. Very simplistic, very straightforward, very practical.
Okay, I'll throw it in the show notes for sure. Yeah. Just to finish, Llewellyn, I wanted to throw a couple of organizational related adages or sayings at you to get your opinion on them. They're sayings that are certainly of personal interest to myself, and I think will be of big interest to a lot of people listening. There's two, and I'll start with the first one, which is the concept of work-life balance. What does that kind of mean to you, and how can people negotiate that in the best way possible for themselves?
It's a very interesting one, because before the pandemic was totally different, right? I think we started to realize now that it's more about work-life integration than it is about work-life balance, especially with more hybrid working, more remote working jobs and stuff taking place. It's really about how do we negotiate these two areas of our lives and how do we integrate them into one another. I think if you look at it in a very practical way, is that I always kind of like make the joke in my own mind. It's like, I'm only being paid for 8 hours a day, right? I work a lot longer than 8 hours a day, don't get me wrong. But I physically only get paid for those 8 hours. The more that I work, the lesser my value becomes. If I work 8 hours and I get paid $100 per hour, that's what I'm worth. If I work 16 hours but only getting paid for 8, my value is $50 an hour, right? So I always make that joke in my mind. And also starting to know that your time is the only commodity that is not replenishable, and it's the most expensive thing you can give to someone. So knowing that in your mind, it is trying to say, like, how can I work my 8 hours or 9 hours in such a way that I address my work-related needs, but also addressing my personal needs. And I think the most important thing there is having a negotiation, having a clear expectations with your line manager, because that's the person that's going to enforce these rules. Secondly is having very clear boundaries around what is acceptable for you and not. So for example, for me, I have this irrational fear of emails. I check my emails like minutely. Like in this conversation is the only time in a long time that I haven't actually checked it, but in 2 hours. But if an email comes in, I have to respond to it immediately. The problem is I'm always in work mode, and it creates anxiety for me. So I thought, like, I will try to implement things to say, well, because emails are work related and it makes me feel anxious, I will only check emails at 3 times during my work day, for example, right? And also communicate this very clearly to my line managers or to my boss or to whatever the case might be. So that is one way for me to manage. The second thing is to also make sure that I build in time for things that's important for me and for people that's important for me. So making sure that I do schedule personal time, just like I'm scheduling my work-related appointments and things. And I think also very important from a work-life balance or work-life integration perspective is to see how can I make the transition between things that I need to do. So for example, let's say I work from home and I need to clean my house because my girlfriend is coming and I need to do washing and go shopping and etc. How can I do those things in such a way, personal stuff, that doesn't affect my work? Same principle backwards. How can I do these things in such a way that doesn't affect these activities that I need to do? So the work related is quite easy. In between meetings, I can quickly go put my washing in the washing machine, for example, as a stupid example. Personal wise, I can do the same thing. So during this time with my partner, I'm not going to check my emails. I'm not going to check work related stuff. I'm not going to talk about work. and being very strict with regards to that. So that's the work-life integration negotiation thing.
Yeah, that makes more sense. Work-life integration. I like that reframe. The other adage I wanted to ask you about was, how useful do you think this is as career advice, which I'm sure everyone listening has heard? Follow your passion.
In what respect? You have to be very clear there now.
In the context of whatever it is that you find blissful, that you find intrinsically motivating, that is passionate to you, just do that as a career.
The reason why I asked that question, the reason why I asked that question is twofold. The one is like, if you do something that you love doing as a hobby or as a passion or etc., it will eventually become work. It will also eventually start draining you. On the other end, doing things that you are passionate about, think grit, long-term interest, perseverance, using your strengths, you will get a lot more energy and stuff out of it. But you also know, for example, a good friend of mine, very good entrepreneur, right, makes millions, right, but he's working 22 hours a day, for example. He's always stressed, always anxious. All his relationships are falling apart. So he's very passionate about the stuff that he's doing, but now that's become the only part of his life. For me, I think you can become passionate about anything, and it's really important to do the stuff that you feel is meaningful to you, right? And that you feel the stuff that you can do can contribute to something larger. I think the problem is that if you only focus on that, right, and there's no return in a way, it's going to drain you a lot longer. So I think figure out the stuff that's meaningful for a way, but apply the same principles and processes you would have done in the courses in university that you didn't like, right? It's a process, there's an end to it, there are certain things that I need to do, and keep that kind of like in the back of your mind, because it's a job, right, on the one end, but it is something that you also kind of like that energy because you want to give a lot more than what you have, because I love this thing. Because if you do that, you will get burned out. And I am talking from a personal experience here, where you give 450%, because you love the stuff that you're doing. You're publishing 20 papers in a year. You're doing all of these talks. You're doing all of this stuff, and eventually there's nothing that gives energy anymore. And then you realize at one stage, like, everything in my life is gone, and I'm feeling absolutely crap, and I'm totally burned out. And then you're sitting there, and it's like, okay, but I've done the stuff that's meaningful to me, and I've done the stuff that I'm passionate about. Why am I feeling this way? Right? And then I start to resent the things that I'm actually doing, because now it's like that's the stuff that made me, that drained me. The stuff that I felt really good and really meaningful. This is the stuff that actually made me unhappy. But it's not because they made me unhappy. It's because I let it. I gave it a lot more. I gave it a lot more of things than what it's supposed to. That analogy of the two wolves. The one that you feed more is the one that's going to win, right? So that's, I think, my advice. Figure out the stuff that you're passionate about. Just see it also as anything else in your life that's draining energy, because that also does. But don't give it too much. Don't give it everything. Give it just enough what it needs to get you through the day.
Yeah. No, great advice on burnout as well. Yeah. Finally, do you have any final words of advice or kind of pearls of wisdom that you wanted to share with people listening?
I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is about change, and like more from like an existential perspective. And I've been reading a lot around this, and it basically boils down to you can do four things. And I realized that you always have four choices in every situation. You can leave the situation as it is. So go with the status quo, right? Don't change anything which will be negative towards you. You can change yourself to adapt to the situation. You can change the situation to adapt to you, or you can leave. And I think it's important to understand that it doesn't matter what the situation is, you always have these four choices. And if you've tried to stay with things as it is, it will not change the situation, will not feel better. If you try to change the situation, ask for resources, do the things that you need, ask for the feedback that you require, you're not getting that, trying to change it doesn't work, try to change yourself. If learning new skills, new capabilities, putting in time management stuff, if that doesn't work, don't feel obligated to stay. And it doesn't mean that you're a failure if you leave. So I think that would be my final advice. Always remember, you always have these 4 choices.
I love it. Sounds very empowering for people listening. So thank you. And yeah, I want to thank you for your time today, all the wisdom you've shared, but also just all the fantastic research you've done. You've introduced me to a lot of new concepts like the jingle jangle fallacy. I've never heard of that before, reading your papers, PERMA +4 model. So you've certainly enlightened and enriched my world, and I'm sure people listening will have a very similar experience. So thank you, Llewellyn.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, indeed. It was really nice talking to you, and also for all of the prep work and all the conversations beforehand. I think you're doing a great job, and I think it's a really nice thing. So thank you for allowing me to be part of it.
And that was Positive Psychology, a deep dive with Dr. Llewellyn van Zyl. I hope there's a lot for you there to take away. And I think the biggest takeaway for me was Dr. van Zyl's suggestions about systematic disclosure or systematic self-disclosure and how that can build meaningful relationships. That's something that I think I've been aware of, but will certainly try and implement more and more and more in my relationships moving forward, just to help build a deeper foundation between me and the people that I love in my life. I hope there were some takeaways for you, and please feel free to pop them below if you want to share what you did take away. And as always, if you were to hit subscribe or share this podcast or episode with a friend, that would be amazing, as this is how I continue to grow the show and communicate evidence-based science out to the community. Thanks for tuning in today, and I will catch you all next Tuesday for a discussion into exercise and mental health with Dr. Rhiannon White.